Hello, everyone, and welcome to my critique of Katie Brunner's final paper for modern rhetorical criticism, Queering the Bible, examining the constraints on theological rhetoric and queer theory in Matthew Vine's The Gay Debate, the Bible and Homosexuality. First of all, I want to say, from a personal perspective, I have loved watching this paper develop and seeing where it goes. Of course, this is an issue that's important to me, and I think that Katie, you have addressed it in a fantastic way. That's why, honestly, I'm struggling a little bit with this paper because having watched it develop so much, I'm struggling to find really points for improvement at this point. Also because this is an extension of your fourth paper, and I really liked that paper and the route that it took. I think I attach very strongly to critical rhetoric and queer theory. So I agree with everything that you're putting forth right now. So it's very well written. I love your arguments for it, and I think that it's set up very, very well. In terms of what you presented, I honestly am not sure that I would change anything. The one thing that I would suggest is maybe getting a little bit more of Vine's and the artifact into the introduction. You put forth a lot of theory for the introduction, which is hard to attach to. I know it's kind of a speech thing, a public speaking type thing, but I honestly do believe that having some kind of attention-getting device somewhere in the intro can help to get readers invested in what you're going to talk about. And naturally, having an interesting artifact like Vine's work is perfect. So I think just a little bit more Vine's in the introduction would have helped to set it up a little bit better. Otherwise, I love everything that you put forth. What I want to talk about, though, is some points where I feel like there could be extensions or maybe slightly different avenues for you to look into and develop further. Because the way I'm reading this piece is that this is more of a theoretical discussion and development, more of a type of criticism talk with Vine's as an example of it than it is more a focused criticism on Vine's. You do have good Vine's criticism here, but I don't think that's your purpose in this paper, and I'm not sure that it should be. So you're developing this idea of queer theology, and I think it's fantastic that you are going down that route. So that being said, I want to talk to you about that development. First of all, I think that in the future, I would like to see more of a push or more of a dig into religious studies themselves, because I think there could be some things that are beneficial here. Specifically, what I'm thinking about is Vine's as a speaker who is queering theology and scripture. I know I've hit on his credibility, I've hit on his gay identity, I've hit a lot on Vine's himself. And so I hate to hit on him again, but this time I think it directly relates to that idea that you're trying to develop with queer theology. And my question is, who can actually queer theology and scripture? Who, I don't necessarily want to say who has the ability to, but in a way, who is capable of doing that? And the reason I started thinking about this was on page 11, where you started talking about Vine's in terms of him humanizing himself, constructing himself as someone who could attach to the audience and as a fellow Christian, really. And that made me think of my religious studies class I took as an undergrad, and it was a concept of religion proposed by Nancy C. Ring. The book that it is in is The Introduction to the Study of Religion. I think they're on their second edition now. But the idea that she put forth was that religion, if nothing else, is the mindset or the way in which we order our lives out of chaos and make sense of the world around us. That definition has stuck with me now for going on 4 or 5 years, because it makes a lot of sense. And I can't help but wonder if that is how Vine's is so successfully able to queer theology and scripture with within those constraints that you're talking about. So I think that's kind of a key to queer theology that you're developing here, is that because the Bible is the only absolute truth, it's constricted. These alternative things can't possibly exist as a Christian. And therefore, it's notorious. I think it would be very hard to deal with, perhaps as an outsider trying to queer theology. Vines, though, is an insider. In terms of that definition that Nancy Ring put forth, the way he orders his world, the way he makes sense out of the world around him, is already working within the confines and the constraints of theology. So it's not necessarily about his credibility. It's not necessarily about his identity as a gay Christian. It really is kind of about the fact that the way his mind works and the way he would naturally kind of structure and work, I think, might be in the same line. He already follows those constraints so naturally. And therefore, his ability to queer may be helped by his religion. I can't say for sure, obviously, but I would suspect that to queer theology or scripture from an outsider's perspective would be much more difficult to do, because those constraints weigh so much more heavily and are so much more difficult to deal with when not accustomed to them. And it's possible that I may be oversimplifying that idea, but I think that it would be something to look at because of the unique constraints of theology and scripture. Who has the ability to really create a successful queering of them? Just like I mentioned in the last one, the idea of the queer space. And I think that's also a valid point you could develop more, but I think now looking at who can queer for theology might be another way to develop this idea of queer theory in another way. So something that popped in my head, putting it forward, since that's kind of the focus of your paper. The next point that I wanted to discuss is in your last section, your conclusion, actually, dealing with your implications, kind of, if I can use forensics terminology from Rhet Crit. What I'm thinking of is that your second point, your second major paragraph that you talked about, where you discussed the maintenance of power. I think that's a really, really great point, that he's reinforcing the authority of the Bible through his speech and through his acting within those theological constraints that you are developing. What I feel is missing, though, might be the fact that there's things missing. I'm specifically thinking about Macaro's sixth principle. Remembering that this is just a general mindset and guidelines to think about when utilizing other theories as well to guide you. So you primarily focused on queer theory. But I think that Macaro's sixth principle could be another interesting area to develop in this case. His sixth principle was that absence and presence are equally important in the study of symbols. Specifically here, I'm thinking about absence. He talked a lot about what was present, his queering of scripture, his discussion about gays and the struggles that they go through, the issue of marriage in the Bible. Lots of different things were present, but what was absent? And I think that by working within the Christian framework, specifically, Vines does, he does not mention and therefore potentially erases in three different ways. So I want to throw those out there for you. You do not have to agree with me. You are the scholar on this one. But it was things that I couldn't help but think about, that they weren't present in any way, shape, or form. So first of all, transgender individuals, or individuals who identify as queer, not gay or lesbian. What stands out to me is on page 17, you talked about the gender binary and the reinforcement of that. And I think that is very, very clear. And you talked about how that might not sit well with some queer theorists, and I absolutely agree with you on that. What I am thinking about, though, is another of Nicaro's principles, where he talked about how rhetoric constructs and exists in a material world. So I couldn't help but think of moving beyond the theoretical gender binary and into that humanness, the lack of address for transgender individuals and those who are struggling with sexuality outside of gay and lesbian within the church. How does that, what happens to them? That part of the LGBTQ community was kind of erased from Vine's speech. I couldn't find any mention of that kind of thing in his work. So I think by working within those constraints, he maybe reinforced the fact that they don't exist. And really, that has been a struggle within the LGBTQ community for a while. The fact that we focus on the L and the G, but the BTQ kind of gets lost, and there's even some discrimination within the community going along with that. That's an entirely different topic, I know, but I think it reinforces a lot of power differentials within the LGBTQ community as well. So something to think about. The second thing, I question, what about gays who have, gay and lesbian individuals who have left the church for whatever reason? This is a little bit more of a minor point, but I can't help but think how you talked about how Vine's focus really was more about the possibility of an intersection of gay identity and religious identity. And I think that's a valid point to make. I think that is exactly what he's talking about in his work. However, I can't help but wonder what happens to gays without faith. It's interesting then, I think, that it reinforces the idea that there is a right and a wrong way to be gay or to be lesbian, that it may invalidate those outside of the church. The only way to legitimately be a gay individual is to be a gay individual within the church and following along with church expectations on homosexuality. So, like I said, this is a minor point, but it's something to think about. And from what I could tell, Vine's that was absent as well, to use Nicaro's term, and therefore it needs to. He kind of ended up erasing that particular group of individuals. It was all about gay and religion, not necessarily the LGBTQ community as a whole. And then my final point that I couldn't help but think of absence or erasure was that the focus on scripture interpretation erases the institution behind the interpretation, and therefore it doesn't really hit at the root of the power. I perused Vine's work again and did not see any indication of who talked about or who came up with this traditional interpretation. Traditional interpretation was his primary term, and that's where it stopped. That's where the buck of power ended in that case. And the result of that, then, is that the power of the church, the Christian institution, I think, becomes invisible. And that invisibility is what allows that power to often go uninterrogated and just remain a hegemonic structure, remain unquestioned authority over these issues. So I think by putting it in an interpretation framework, which was necessary, I understand, but by engaging in that interpretation-only framework, Vine's kind of made the Christian church itself invisible, and therefore that power remained unquestioned. It wasn't just reinforced, its position as invisible and central was further developed and entrenched. So something that I wanted to bring up, that would be hard to critique the church from there on out. That being said, Katie, this was a great paper. I've loved seeing it develop over the course of the semester, and I think it's well on its way to publication. Maybe you take some of these ideas or some of Adam's ideas to consider in further developments of the paper before publication, but I think this is absolutely fascinating. I love what you're doing, and I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing it in a journal sometime in the future.